Wojciech Maziarski, speaking.
Życzymy Państwu przyjemnej podróży.
So we've seen the two videos, and right now let's go down to earth from the screen. I will welcome you seated so that the camera could follow me well enough. My name is Wojciech Maziarski. I am the editor of the opinions section of Gazeta Wyborcza. I have the pleasure of moderating the panel with following speakers: Janina Ochojska. For sure, you know this activist. She has set up and for months has been the chief of PAH, Polish Humanitarian Action. It's probably one of the biggest in Poland, maybe even in Europe or in the world, humanitarian NGOs. She has been in charge of plenty of projects all over the world, and she has been the member of parliament in the previous government. Next to Janina Ochojska, Sławomir Kalinowski, professor at the Institute of Rural and Agricultural Development of Polish Academy of Sciences. He is inter alia devoting his work to energy poverty, and his scientific research is revolving around the living standards of rural territories. Leszek Stypułkowski, member of the management board of Bank Gospodarstwa BGK. Previously in his long career, he has been occupying plenty of highest managerial seats in Polish entrepreneurships, also international ones, active in Europe, Middle East and Asia. Welcome. Madam Alicja Sielska, an assistant professor at the Institute of Economic Sciences at the University of Wrocław. She is also working at the New York University in Prague. She is researching history of economy, history of labor market. And her interests when it comes to research are focused around gender aspects of economy. She's been analyzing inter alia institutional discrimination of women on the Polish labor market. Good morning. Next to me, Matt Warner, president of Atlas Network, a global non-profit organization which supports NGOs in over 90 countries. And in Poland, recently, last week, they've published a book in Polish, translated into Polish and written by Tom Palner and Matt Warner, titled Development, Human Dignity. It's not yet in print, but you can download it for free on the website of the Foundation of Economic Freedom. You can download a PDF or ebook. It is an absolute coincidence. It's not that we want to promote the book. It's not that we've organized the meetings to promote the book, but it so happened that it has been recently published. And as the topic and content of the book covers what we are going to talk about, so I've mentioned it, and I will tell you why. The topic of our panel is development, responsibility, and the end of poverty. Poverty in the world is decreasing. It's shown by all the stats. No matter which stats you look at, you will find the very same picture, that gradually, on the scale of human lives, slowly but surely, immediately, the poverty in the world is decreasing. I found data that is reflecting it pretty well, that the average life expectancy in the 2018, which is 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the average life expectancy in high-income countries was 81, but in countries with low income, 64. The difference back then was 17 years. But if we go back in time till 1990, which is 28 years ago, the difference between the rich and the poor countries was 24 years, 7 years more. So within 28 years, the difference in life expectancy compared to high and income countries and low income countries decreased by 1/3, almost. Other data confirms that this trend and tendency is indeed as it is. So here comes a question. At least as of 20th century, plenty of countries, high-income countries, were in charge of developmental programs for the lower-income countries. In the majority of countries around the world, there are internal programs which are meant to even out the differences in income and help to the groups which are managing less well when it comes to income. So this is this life expectancy difference a result of those programs, or is it happening despite for them? Or maybe even those programs are being implemented in such an incompetent way that maybe those are even infringing. Maybe without them, this change would be even faster. This is the doubt I faced in the book published by Palmer and Warner. As far as I understood, the book of yours, you believe that paternalistic approach to beneficiaries is harmful. And the key for development and equalizing differences and becoming richer is to treat beneficiaries of assistance as partners and citizens who are dignified, who have their dignity. The floor goes to you as the first one in the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate both you mentioning the book and to our local translators and publishers for it coming out. It's very exciting. I am also grateful that you have invited me and allowed me to speak in English. If you don't have a headset, I assume it's because you either understand English or you're not that interested in what I have to say, and either of those is fine. Yeah, so one of the more interesting things as we celebrate the statistical review that was just shared, the real impact that has happened in the last 40 years as we've seen those living on subsistence levels has fallen from more than 1/3 of the world's population to less than 1/10. The very interesting and striking thing about that is that while that has occurred all across the world, the biggest changes and the largest number of people who've come out of poverty in that time are people living in India and China, two places that are not significant recipients of aid. And this actually should not be surprising, because when we talk about aid, we have to first distinguish between humanitarian aid for emergency relief in a disaster and what I look at, which is the more ongoing, larger development aid that is done in the name of changing institutions and systems over the long term to change the economy of a country. Very different effort than famine relief or other disaster relief. So when we're looking at the more complicated issue of improving a whole economy, one of the things that we have gotten wrong, and this is not controversial now, across the international aid community, everyone is grappling with how is it that despite our best efforts and our greatest experts from around the world, us coming into other people's countries and helping them change the way that they do things isn't really sticking, meaning it's not really lasting. It's not creating the benefits that we want to see, and it isn't creating sort of functional systems and institutions. And why that happens, though, isn't really a surprise, because the countries that have become successful and rich, they have things in common. But the things that they have in common are not policies and institutions that you can just copy and paste into a new setting. The institutions that govern us, whatever country we're in, they function best when they are reflective of the people that stand to either be oppressed or to be liberated as a result. And so the organization I work for, we go around the world and support and stand beside local organizations who represent that culture, that history, and have their own vision for change in the direction of the institutions of liberal democracy, which are not a Western gift to the rest of the world. These ideals are universal. The desire to make your own choices, the desire to live freely and by your own conscience and your own culture and your own religion. And these things can't be tossed aside when we say, let us come show you how to do a stock exchange. Let us come create an infrastructure of roads and bridges for you, which may or may not be done in a way that really optimizes for time and place. So the fundamental idea of dignity, and I'll stop here, we have many important people to listen to, but the important idea of dignity is not just that it's moral and good to respect other people's prerogatives, but it actually has material and practical benefit, because when people are free to make decisions for themselves, all of those decisions add up to an aggregate optimum that leads to growth and shared prosperity.
Thank you. I understand that here we speak about developmental help, so not the help that is caused by an rapid accident like a famine or drought, but a change that is planned and is focused to improve the conditions of life in the country. Now I would like to turn to Janina Ochojska. Many times you organized humanitarian actions, support actions, rescue actions. This is when we have case with pandemic, flood, and similar disasters. We don't have time to think much about that, but you organized projects with a bigger landscape. In what extent local partners were subjects of these projects? What extent of influence they have to establish goals and methods of such a project? From my experience, I can say that quite often this humanitarian aid that you mentioned is transformed into developmental help, so that, in fact, starting humanitarian aid because of war or some other cataclysm somewhere, we should right away add development. Because even in country like Chechnya, where our help took a form of delivering water to residents of Grozny, so organizing the whole institution capable to deliver water wherever it was needed in Grozny. And from the very beginning, this support action involved drivers of water tanks, cars, coordinators of this program who were responsible for deploying water points in particular districts of Grozny. Without local people, we were not able to do that because they knew where we can bypass Russian checkpoints. I'm so detailed about that because I want to show this developmental aspect. After 2 years, we already had a water purification station with 5 filters. Each day in Grozny, we delivered 750,000 liters of water. It's even difficult to imagine. I know how 10,000 liters of water looks like. It's like a water pillow. And then there you can see the volume of it. But after 4 years, our coordinators were capable to run this program on their own. Even before, they just needed supervision, control, because sometimes it happened that they would sell this water. So this kind of situations had to be checked and controlled. So this aid delivery later transferred into water supply facility that worked until all the water system in Grozny was restored. So this is an example. No matter that our organization at that moment had only 2 years, it was an example of a good aid that transferred from humanitarian to developmental, and it led to the rebuild of water supply and sewage system in Grozny. And if we look at other humanitarian actions, like in southern Sudan, we started to build wells. Now, where is this borderline between humanitarian aid and development? It's very difficult to say. Building a well is a development, or is it a humanitarian aid? It is humanitarian aid because people are deprived of access to water, but building this kind of infrastructure, wells, it helps develop local infrastructure, agriculture. Farm animals have water, children can go to school, not go to get water, and so on. So it generates development, and we have more than thousands of these kind of wells. It impacted the development of Sudan, maybe not in a way that we can say that it's time to wrap up this program. There are many other organizations that still do that. But from my experience, first of all, the participation of locals and making use of their knowledge of the context and area and situation has to be used. When we had a disaster in Poland, a flood, when bread and water was delivered to people, that's the proper time when we need to think about development, because there comes rebuilding, and we always need to rebuild better. Exactly, the question arises, should we build back in the same places where water can return? No, it has to be built better. So now let's go from Polish to some other playground, and let's take a look from other perspective. Janina Ochojska said we are deliverers of this humanitarian and developmental aid, but also we are beneficiaries of developmental help from European Union, for example. Cohesion funds, funds for agricultural development. This money gets to Poland to Polish farms, Polish villages, and it changed, it radically changed a face of Polish village. The question to Sławomir Kalinowski: is a Polish agricultural sector a beneficiary? I know farmers and people from villages who are not farmers that have small pieces of land, and they receive some subsidies from EU, and this kind of financing was a development of villages, rural areas. I will answer this question. I'm not avoiding it. Just wanted before to comment when you said about poverty. You said about qualitative aspect of poverty. We usually tend to think about poverty as a lack of capacity to satisfy basic needs. And we want to see poverty in more multidimensional nature, not just availability of the assets, but the lack of access to the funds. That's about a definition part. And now going to your question, nowadays, village, or maybe it's better to say farmers, are beneficiaries of European Union support. If you look at all the funds that were obtained in the frames of EU policy directed to Poland, a third is a joint agricultural policy. The policy that 20 years ago was, its goal was to level the farmers' situation, so their profitability and the money they make was comparable to European farmers. So what was the result of joint rural policy? Petrification of rural lands. It's not profitable to send land. Half of farms in Poland have less than 5 hectares. 3/4 have less than 10 hectares. If we compare it to farms in Germany or France, 60, 70, in Ukraine, more than 100 hectares, we say that in the start the situation is worse because in Poland average is around 11 hectares of an average farm. But this joint agricultural policy, of course, it helps. 2/3 of this policy is the first pillar, is direct support, direct financial aid to farms. And what is the result? Among many social groups in Poland, farmers are most vulnerable to extreme poverty, because a farm that receives 5,000 of donation from joint agricultural policy can improve its economical situation. But if we speak about rural areas, agriculture or farmers are just a part of this social group that lives in a village. But in our common understanding, a village is at the same time we relate that to farming. But it's only 8.4% of people active, professionally active in the village are agriculturals. We need to think in a wider context. As a help to a village that is older and older, with the outflow of young people from the villages, how to fight poverty in a wider context, because it's very diverse. Village is very diverse. If it's not gentrified around bigger cities, if it's not repeating the bigger cities around, it's 8%. But if we look at peripheral village, which is a bit farther from regional centers or county centers, this extreme poverty, so the worst kind of poverty, is in a threshold of 14% even. So different tools different ways of counteracting this poverty is relevant, because it's not only the lack of financial resources, but it's also a road infrastructure that, no matter all the amounts going into Poland, is not sufficiently used by inhabitants of the village areas. So the help we received in the frameworks of the joint agricultural policy and cohesion fund petrified, so the frozen economical situation in these places, especially rural ones, for long years. But do we treat seriously enough in Poland what was written in Warner or Palmer's book, A Dignity, that can be expressed as treating beneficiaries of aid seriously as an adults responsible for their life, their satisfying their needs, or the approach to Polish village is like to children, people living in rural areas, that they need to be carried by a hand. A professor of our institute used to say that a village has to be finally accepted in Poland, because Polish village is a certain, like a train car that stayed in a train station. It's not connected to the agriculture. Not all the aspects of activization of a support in Polish village are implemented. Do we take them by the hand? It's difficult to say. If it's villages around big cities, of course, they can do it without this kind of support, without direct help that state can offer. But if we talk about a remote villages far from big cities, unfortunately, the lack of proper capacities, deprivation of needs in different levels, that leads that quite often, except for a fishing rod that we would like to give, we need to also provide a fish so that people can live at least at some level. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Alicja Sielska to save the gender parity for one reason, and also to gather attention to one another social group that is also receiving programs, not so much of financial help, but more of a gender help. I mean, so to women. If we are talking about equalizing, leveling the chances, Poland is making up to Western Europe. They started before, but recent years we started to say about women discrimination that we tended not to see, because we have women in leading positions, representatives of middle class, women that have professions that before were considered to be manly professions, but then it turns out that women in the same positions make less money than men in average. Or we suddenly see that by accident, so it happened that in companies' management there are men. For years in editors, men would be dominating, and I haven't noticed that for years. Only representatives of younger generations, they showed it to me, said, Wojtek, look at our collegium, our editor group, and indeed I saw this problem.
So the question is whether the programs which are meant to equal the chances, such as introduce gender parity in the management boards, are those of help? Or is it just to calm things down, but they are maybe even counterproductive? Thank you. I would like to come back to what Matt said when it comes to the poverty in the international context, because we've started to discuss pretty broadly about poverty in the international context, local context of Polish rural territories. I want to draw your attention to the fact that often when we are speaking about poverty in the international dimension, we are often thinking us and them, countries that are developed and countries that are developing. And as of 60s, last century, when the countries in Asia and one of the African countries, meaning Botswana, this is an incredible example, they started to catch up with Western Europe and Northern America. And there are still countries of sub-Saharan Africa. So now when we take a look at which part of the world where we have the smallest number of democratic countries, it turns out it's sub-Saharan Africa that receives most aid when it comes to fighting poverty. And this suggests an answer that besides for dignity, cooperation, what can be a consequence? Or how can we mitigate poverty in the international context? I want to quote another data. It is about Index Freedom Economic of the World of the Fraser Foundation. It shows that 25% of countries that are the most liberal ones compared to 25 least liberal countries has 7 times higher income per person and 16 times smaller poverty. But what are you talking about when you mean liberal? Those that have democracy and freedoms, or economy? Broadly understood. We would have to take a precise look at the I quoted data, but we would have to take a look at how it was gathered. So what I want to draw your attention to is that on Monday, 2 economists, Robinson and Achimov, so-called institutional economists, drew our attention to the role played by institutions, meaning individual property, when it comes to mitigating poverty. And I believe that if we are thinking about international context, what makes a decrease in poverty, it's worth to take a look at how democratic a country is, what's the access of freedoms, individual responsibility, development, and coming back to the question that you've posed, this is specifically about maintaining parities. I am in favor of having specialists and the people who are best in a domain rather than forcing parities. That's a short answer to this question. I don't want to take too long time. I see no other solution than searching for the best match. I don't want doing things by force, for instance, in management to maintain parity of gender rather than recruit the best people. I understand that here in our interventions we will hear plenty of interventions that provoke us for discussion, but let's leave discussion to the discussion part. In the first round of interventions, I would still like to give floor to Leszek Stypułkowski. I want to ask him about banks catching up, because in the book of Matt Palmer and Matt Warner, there is quite a lot about Western and foreign experts who are arriving to the undeveloped countries, and as a gift they bring recipes, solutions, know-how, etc. It doesn't work often. But in the case of Poland, the banking sector after 1809 is an example of such a scope which has been cured in a pretty radical and efficient manner. To what extent has it been done by our own means? Was it needed to have foreign assistants, the experts who were arriving to Marriott Hotel, wouldn't we manage without them? Whether the banking sector, I'm using it as an example of a model, because in other sectors we would probably observe other things. Wouldn't we be able to do it by our own means, in an independent manner? Thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. Of course, we would manage somehow. We don't know what the results would be, because it is this way of thinking that from today's point of view, we could have done certain things differently. We've had experts arrive with a shock therapy which was very difficult for the society, and right now is perceived by 30% of society as the one that took the dignity away. But still, we are witnesses of unprecedented development of Poland in last 30 years, when from developing economy we became developed economy. The assistance instruments that we've obtained from the EU, for instance, we observe how the country is changing. We saw how the infrastructural investments looked like. In the development banks, we are researching to which extent those are efficient. It turns out that such basic indicators such as GDP growth, GDP of jobs, number of jobs, and growth of export, those were really good. But when it comes to efficiency or in how innovative enterprises were, not so much happens. When it comes to innovativeness, Poland is 39th, I guess, and we are only ahead of the new member states of EU, Romania and Bulgaria. So the diagnosis that we are having in the development banks is that the aid distributed in the form of dotations and grants is not in favor of development of innovation. What's more important is everywhere where it's possible to ensure a possibility for the free markets. So such banks as BGK started to distribute via different private sector banks that were competing with one another, but were much closer to clients, to people who wanted to fulfill their plans and take loans thanks to guarantees, having access to the capital. And access to the capital is an absolute foundation of fighting poverty. But in the guarantee formula, where normally an entrepreneur doesn't have such a capacity to get a loan, but thanks to the guarantees, he can implement his own business plan and can have such a loan. And this is adulthood that Matt mentioned. This is not imposing what they have to do. They can create it on their own. We have expanded such assistance in the framework of Ukrainian Facility Program. So we have covered with guarantees the enterprises that are in Ukraine, close to the border. So we've seen plenty of interest in that. So allowing people to decide what they want to do, what they want to invest in, what they want to take a loan for, and making money accessible, for instance, in a form of guarantees, which is share of risks. It's one of the pillars of supporting development and combating poverty. But another pillar, which is very important, is what this year's Nobel winners wrote about. Those are institutions which have to be high quality. And such high quality of institutions comes from a competitive market. Those are NGOs, and this is a good news for the third sector. You are confirmed to be a crucial element so that around the world they could be better situation. So the Nobel Prize winners are supporting you. It is important to send it to the right places. The third component, which sometimes is not being looked at, is the question of investing on the basis of value, so that after the money, there would be such values which are which pertain to the local communities. So esteem, respect for tradition, for the local traditions, for understanding the context. Those are people's values, of people liberalism. Those three components can be a good mix so that the system of development support would work more fluently. Thank you. I remember that Sławomir Kalinowski raised his hand when we spoke of gender parities. I promised to come back to it, but I would like to continue this topic of dignity. Mr. Stypułkowski said that for 30% of people in Poland, the time of market therapy after the 1990, it was a shock therapy. I would rather call it Balcerowicz program. This is the time of taking dignity away. After I read your book, it seemed to me that framing this issue in such a way makes no sense, because this is when those people got their dignity back. Before, in the socialistic times, an employee was fully dependent on an employer who offered him a job, a kindergarten, money, pretty much everything. And such an employee was completely without any influence. So the shock therapy appreciated his freedom. As I saw it in your book, you are an independent adult person. We give you a chance, but you have to manage on your own. Do I understand well the understanding of freedom that I found in your book?
Well, yes, in part. I think it's also important to recognize that there are real difficult times that come as a consequence of trying to rectify bad policy. And I don't dismiss or diminish what major job disruption feels like. But I think it's important to remember how did we get into such an abrupt experience? These things can happen in a free market, of course, but what not centralizing all of the decisions does is it distributes the risks across so that things can happen a little bit more iteratively and gradually. So of course some industries are going to become obsolete when other industries come along. You go from the whale blubber for lights, and then Standard Oil does kerosene for lights, so now no whale blubber. And then Thomas Edison comes along, and then we don't have this. And that can be, nothing determines how abrupt or not abrupt that is, but it is definitely a high risk when you centralize control over the economy and you make these big decisions that everybody depends on that are unsustainable. And the fallout from that is going to be messy. And there isn't an easy recipe book for how to get back to strong institutions of liberal democracy when you've made a lot of errors in the way you do things. And I want to point out one other quick thing, which is experts are not bad. Experts are good. We should all aspire to get as much formal knowledge as possible. And this conference here is an example of sharing expertise with each other and learning from each other. We should be doing that globally all the time. Very, very important. The key issue in what happens in aid is there's a lot of what's called conditional aid and tied aid. And conditional aid is we will help you as long as you follow our rules. And tied aid is we will help you as long as all the money goes to our companies to provide those services. And what's missing is the people who we're hoping to see thrive should have a stronger decision-making role in the way that these solutions get both decided on and executed. And so a lot of the times, we see this in the U.S., when we have a very concrete centralized trade agreement that has a lot of very specific terms and conditions, and then we change that agreement, that's going to affect people differently. And a change in government policy can be a lot more abrupt than a shift in the market most of the time.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Kalinowski, I saw 2 times you wanted to add something in parity of genders and assessing the programs. When we talk about political change, PGR, people received the opportunity, freedom, certain freedom, but but without a proper skill. It's easy to say you can do whatever you want, but if a person has no skills, no knowledge, I was not equipped with the same knowledge and skills that my colleagues would have from cities. I did not have the same capacities to learn, to go through mathematics or English language courses, to later compete with them. So the freedom, yes, of course, but this freedom, unfortunately, well, it was disrupted by the capacities of the people. And very briefly, perhaps we will have different views on the same matter related to parities. I definitely agree. For each position, a person with the right qualifications should apply. But for some reason, quite often a man would receive this position. Among men and women, there is the same number of qualified people, but not necessarily they have equal chances of getting the position. Let's see at education on each level, MA, then PhD, then postdoc. On MA level, on PhD level, maybe women dominate, but then this number of persons is shifted, and then we have more men. So the qualifications, that's important. But I would say that the number of people with the same qualifications is exactly the same. If I may answer to that, I think that not always. I don't want to generalize, but it's worth noticing in this discussion how big role election play in this. If you said about different levels of education, we can think about why certain directions, faculties are occupied by men and others by women. We can't say that there is no equality of chances or choices. For some reasons, teaching studies are more occupied by humanitarian studies are more occupied by women, and sciences are more occupied by men. No matter the support programs for women to start technical directions, if we look at the number of postdoc or Belvedere professor title, those are more often men. But again, how big is the matter of choice and some priorities in life? Maybe it's a fact of exclusion, or maybe it is a reason because that women quite often start with taking care of children. And often this role is played hugely by women, and then maybe different preferences. Because even if we accept that taking care of a smaller children, if then a child goes to a primary school, then high school, then maybe we have time to write articles and attend conferences. But when we look at the life cycle, the number of these women is not increasing when it comes to these positions. So I wouldn't say there is a lack of chances equality, but a matter of choices and priorities and decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm in front of a dramatic decision because I am to decide if I should ask another question, because I see that hosts signal that we have little time. Do we have some voices from the audience? We have two voices from the audience. Okay, in that case, I will just leave last 5 minutes for voices from the audience, and I will ask our panelists another question, starting from Janina Ochojska. But I will ask you just to say in a nutshell, what is our responsibility of those who, the West, for giving aid, for sustaining non-democratic systems? Because if we provide aid, if we use services of different countries, in case of migrational pressure, we outsource this pressure to other non-democratic states, like to Rwanda. Norwegian author Noran Balin analyzed how cohesion funds from EU or other funds are used to feed Viktor Orban political family. Did you have this dilemma in your aid missions? Because you need to help people, but at the same time it's petrifying or assisting dictatorship that they live in. Honestly, no, we didn't have similar situation, but however, definitely help in country like Chechnya or other countries where dictatorship regimes are, it's difficult. Nevertheless, we need to be aware that if we access people directly and they are partners, then it's much easier. But that's exactly what I was thinking about, because I wanted to mention the role of transferring big funds to solve some our European problems, like limiting the access of migrants to Europe. We gave money to Turkey some time ago. Tunisia received funds, Egypt. So giving this kind of money, in fact, is directed to limit human rights. In Tunisia, this money that Ursula von der Leyen gave to Tunisian government are used, among other, to purchase buses that would take away migrants on a desert. So if this is a purpose of the money that is transferred to regimes, these are money that are wasted and that NGOs can use, I'm sure, much better. Well, exactly, these aid funds serve our goals, not satisfying beneficiaries' needs. Just in few words, my impression is that during a number of years, this aid served our needs, satisfying our need for charity, and in some way made us believe that in our country is a bit better, but it's a sieve through which this money flew somewhere. I will say something controversial because I thought about this sustaining authoritarian governments, regimes, and my conclusion is that us citizens of Western world, we are responsible for sustaining these regimes when we buy or consume the products, when we decide only by marketing parameters, and the rest is just market mechanisms. So within the spirit of freedom, it's the matter of how aware we are, how awarely we choose, and in what extent we can agree that from our consumers' choices, this stream of funds goes to this totalitarian government. Not to look far, 20 years of Angela Merkel in Germany, Chancellor, the concept of the trade was they purchase cheap resources, and by that they will be able to export liberal democracy to Russia. But there was a lack of the right institutions that could transfer change, also the lack of values that we believe in and that I believe we should more actively manifest, and at the same time include in our consumers' choices. Any voices in this regard? If I may add, I also want to say that often the extent of how authoritarian is the country depends on on the context and situation, like the help from US to Egypt. If you remember, quite loud case visit of our president in Rwanda in February this year. We often assess the authoritarian state of a country depending on the situation. So now questions from the audience, please. Should I approach with the microphone to you? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for so interesting discussion. I have a question about where it started. So from the introduction of Wojciech Maziarski and the conclusion that globally poverty is decreasing. Recently we saw Poverty Watch 24 that says that in Poland in recent years the poverty increases, and in 24 and in 23 it's bigger than in 2022. And it provides a lot of drastic data, but there are also quite shocking moments like poverty among working people. So a situation when people have job, they make money, but they still have problem to make it to break even, and it's not just a marginal situation, but those are hundreds, thousands of people in Poland. So the question is, how do you see solving this kind of situation, especially during increase of inflation and not so quickly increasing salaries? What kind of actions should we take? Is this question directed to someone particular? No, for everyone, whoever wants. If I may, maybe I will start. I think it's good to start with the definition of poverty itself. If we say about international context, we understand that as extreme poverty, which is defined by a World Bank usually as living for $2 or less a day. And a report that you are talking about, I'm not familiar with this one, but I don't think it's a report that considers extreme poverty. But when it comes to extreme poverty, is it that? No, it's extreme poverty measured by main statistics office in Poland. So it's 700 zlotys for a single person and 600 something with the four people household. So this poverty is increasing, 2.5 million people, as it concludes from the report. Those are data from June, 2.5 million, 500,000 children. Those who you mentioned, poor working people, but their income does not allow to satisfy their basic needs. But if we divide all the people basing on their salaries, then these 10% that earn least, those are people who are threatened by deprivation of needs and extreme poverty. And it's important to look at the situation of addicting poor people from social aid.
Czy takie fluktuacje okresowe w skali kraju pogłębiania się ubóstwa zaprzeczają czy kwestionują ten ogólny trend, o którym czytałem w panu książce, historyczny, który mierzony jest w skali wieków czy dziesiątków lat co najmniej, a nie w skali tam kilku lat?
I think if I understand your question.
I'm sorry, I was interpreting to the Polish channel. Should I do it now?
Oh, it's on? Okay. Yeah, so the important thing, if you're interested in seeing shared prosperity increase. Now I got to switch this. Okay. Sorry. Is where does increase in growth and shared prosperity come from? And as we've just heard a couple of reports about this week's announcement about Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson winning the Nobel Prize, looking at the relationship both between democracy and growth and the importance of what criticisms of their work, which I have some, but not about this. The core of their work is that the nature of institutions is kind of messy. But this is progress in understanding compared to a couple of years ago when development economists won the Nobel Prize in economics for what their approach, which was let's just be very scientific about how people work in a society, and so let's use randomized control trials to see what types of development projects work. And that got a lot of backlash, particularly from development practitioners and a lot of other esteemed economists, because when it comes to what's known in economics as complexity economics or agent-based economics, meaning people can make their own decisions, you cannot control for all the things that you would need to in order to have a replicable or scalable result. And so what works in one place doesn't work in another place. Why? Because people are different. And so that's important. So that's helpful progress to understand that the policies and institutions, the rules of the game, and I don't use the word game to trivialize it, but it's a helpful way to think about what are the rules that dictate the way that people can find and discover and create new economic opportunity. And where it is most deferential to individuals, we tend to see better results, and where it is complicated and constrained, and there's a lot of decisions made on behalf of others in the economy, it just becomes much harder to create an optimal situation. And so you're always going to have some spectrum of wealth, but the question is, what is the most fair and the approach that makes it most likely that we're going to see the kinds of huge gains that we saw over the last 30 years.
Thank you very much. I also have a feeling we didn't exhaust the topic. Probably it's impossible to exhaust it. We could continue discussing for a very long time, and I want to encourage you to do so at the break. Unfortunately, we have to finish. I am aware of the fact, and I remember that the lamp is right into my eyes. I don't see who was interested in still asking yet another question. Unfortunately, we didn't make it on time, so you will not be able to take the floor, but you can approach us and talk on the coffee break in a non-formal way. And I thank very much to all our panelists, and a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you very much.
Radość, nadzieja, życie, wyzwanie, pasja, pamięć, zaufanie, pokój, jedność. Słowa tworzą świat. Polskie Radio. Źródło wiarygodnych informacji.
Uwielbiam szycie w sieci. Wczoraj podszyłem się pod wnuczka, wieczorem uszyłem intrygę na apce randkowej, a dziś planuję grubymi nićmi szyte oszustwo z promocją. Tak się szyje.
Na oszustów są sposoby. Zapoznaj się z poradami ekspertów na niedajsiepodszyć.pl.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Ihre Ausreise.
kanapki z kawiorem.
Nadzwyczajna kasa.
Obrażanie dziennikarzy telewizji polskiej.
Chodzi o działania polityczne.
Przygotowanie ofiar dla pedofilów.
Für Deutschland.
TVP Info. Włącz się na nowo.
Polskie Radio.
Jedynka.
Dziś Nowy Jork, jutro Londyn. Za chwilę Paryż, Warszawa, Berlin. Na całym świecie kultura pulsuje rytmem. Wystarczy tylko włączyć dwójkę. Dwójka, Polskie Radio. Jesteś na miejscu.
Plany biznesowe powstają z marzeń. Dlatego nie ma dwóch takich samych firm. Jedni chcą działać na całym świecie. Innym cały świat mieści się w dłoni. Sukces biznesu to nie tylko jego wielkość, ale też szczęście, jakie przynosi ludziom. PKO Bank Polski.
Rodzina spółek Pelion to 12 tysięcy osób pracujących w ponad 300 spółkach w Polsce, Szwecji, Wielkiej Brytanii i na Litwie. Jesteśmy liderem w branży ochrony zdrowia. Od 1990 roku dbamy o długość i jakość życia. Pracować z nami możesz w jednym z 7 obszarów.